all I can say is that a lot of them are delivered. I don't know if the more extreme samples are not delivered. But I was looking through these trying to come up with some images that we could talk about, but they're similarly frustrating in terms of trying to develop, as I want to do, a kind of a narrative out of them. This piece in particular kind of struck my interest, though. It's basically 4 horizontal cuts, and 2 of them come obviously from the same image. It's a kind of airy, modern dining hall covered with hundreds of white tablecloths and chairs on which are aqua-colored rectangles that look like it's some sort of banquet of some sort. And then in between, on one side, on the top, is a hand covering a head defensively in a black and white photo, another hand reaching out either protectively or threateningly to that, and another face moving past it. And then on the bottom, a series of men in army helmets holding guns. This looks like something from the American Civil Rights era of the 1960s. This looks like either something from the same era or from 50s fascist Europe. So this interesting interweaving of these stories seemed to have a narrative. And I asked Tim about that, and he said, well, let's look at the picture here. He said, I don't even remember this. So we took a photograph of this. We blew it up sort of like the way they did the forensic work in Blade Runner. When you blow up this image, you very clearly see that this is a menu. It says Hackney's, and there's a Red Lobster here. Hackney's turns out to be a famous restaurant in Atlantic City that lasted from about 1920 to 1960, 65. At one time, it was the biggest seafood restaurant, perhaps the biggest restaurant of any kind in the world. It had 3,200 seats. Hackney, who ran it, was this tireless promoter, had ads in all the papers in the United States with slogans like, "Come eat where you fish," and "Home of the purified lobster." Yeah. Apparently, the lobsters were in great. This is the first restaurant maybe where you could find your own lobster purifying in a pool of clean chlorinated water, and then you would not. I don't think they had like. You would have lobster thermidor, these sort of fancy recipes. It's specialized in these sort of weird mid-century concoctions, and they had all sorts of attractions. The Miss America Cocktail Lounge. And their signature drink, which I hope many of you have sampled a version of, the Miss America cocktail, which had Kentucky bourbon, New Jersey Applejack, lemons from California, sugar from Louisiana, and I don't know what else. That's all I could dig up. But Applejack is not the little beer cider. It's 60 proof alcohol. And it makes you wonder how the West was won. That was the drink that Johnny Appleseed was growing when he was planting all the trees. It wasn't apples to eat, it was liquor. The modern father of mail art is probably Ray Johnson, a sort of patron saint of artists. It's a kind of a great failed artist, great genius, a non-recognized. It's a kind of artist, everybody's favorite unknown artist. One of those sort of paradoxical, most famous unknown artists in the world. He was a friend of Rauschenberg's and Warhol's. He participated in that world, and then he removed himself from that world and created these obsessive collage-like forms, which he mailed out, kept careful records of, and had the foresight to give himself an epic artist's death. He dove off a bridge on January 13th, was last seen doing the backstroke out to sea. And then his body washed up. The rumors began to swirl immediately that this was a great performance piece. He was 67, which adds up to 13, and he had spent the night before in room 247 of a motel, which adds up to 13. It was the 13th day of the year. But I have no idea if that's where. Perhaps the real first male artist was Cleopatra, according to legend. She was in a contest with her brother Ptolemy, the pharaoh, for the attention of Caesar. Caesar had come as a sort of governor, dictator of Egypt. At that point, it was a virtual colony of the Roman Empire, and they were both contesting for his ear, and Ptolemy was keeping Cleopatra away. So she had her faithful servant, Apollodorus the Sicilian, wrap her up in a rug and smuggle her past the guards, and then unrolls the rug, and she steps out, and Cleopatra and Caesar have an affair and a kid, and celebrated in every movie ever made about Cleopatra. I was especially interested in the most famous painting of that scene is by Jerome, and you see Cleopatra, who is for some reason topless, as so many characters in Jerome's paintings were for no particular reason. But in the background you see Caesar being surprised by this sight of he's a 50-year-old man, and this young woman is stepping out of the carpet, and his hands are like splayed, his eyes are wide, his mouth is dropped. He's basically, as far as I can see, the inspiration for almost every Tex Avery cartoon of a wolf. You see the wolf in Little Hot Red Riding Hood, sort of expressing with every non-phallic instrument at Avery's command, sort of male arousal. The eyes come out, the tongue comes out, the hands begin to pump wildly. The epitome of male desire. This was actually distributed to the troops during the World War II, and it was not allowed to be seen because it was considered too explicit, which it was, I suppose. My father had a cookbook that he had retained from years before he was married, and it was called A Wolf in Chef's Clothing. It was a famous cookbook that Esquire magazine put out for his. So there'd be like 3 different kinds of omelets. The American omelet with jelly and sugar, the French omelet with butter, the Italian omelet with tomatoes. This is an example of one of their. This is a Russian dressing, and it's quite simple. Everything is sort of schematic. A bowl, and then this is chili, and then mayonnaise. It's all going in. There's a number of cups or spoons that tell you how much to put in. Caviar, chives. We snip off the chives in here. Horseradish, and ketchup. And then you mix it up with an egg beater, and you shake it. And then they always have a sort of slightly salacious introduction to this. So on the top, there's a kind of Orientalist image of this silhouetted figure, or female figure, in a sort of a bearskin hat. And then the caption is, "Ach, Karl, what you missed," which at the time I just assumed was like that was a Russian joke. But now that I'm looking at it, I realize that Karl and Ach are German words. So all I can imagine is is a joke about Hitler's invasion of Russia. That this is occurring right after World War II, and Hitler had tried to get to Moscow and he hadn't, and if he'd gotten there, he would have been able to enjoy Russian dressing. I made a few copies. If anybody would like this, and you want to take a recipe home for Russian dressing, feel free. There's only 15, but I assume not everybody will want one. In the 1840s, excuse me, a man named Henry Brown was a slave in Virginia, and his wife and children were sold from the plantation in which they all lived to another plantation. His family was broken up, and he was understandably distraught. He decided that he would do anything rather than live another year in slavery. And he knew it. He had a friend, a white carpenter. He was skilled as a carpenter himself, and he asked him. They began to concoct a plan to smuggle himself out of slavery. And they had contacts in the abolitionist North in Philadelphia. And Brown had $160. Half of his money he spent building a box. It's about 3 feet by 2 feet by 2.5 feet. He lined it with some sort of mat carpeting. And they contacted a shipping company which was renowned for its efficiency and discretion. Now, the mail system in the United States at this point was a point of pride and was a very powerful political weapon. Stephen Douglas, the great abolitionist leader, said cheap postage was had immense moral bearing because it allowed this communication, especially from the North to the South, of literature and ideas and arguments that undermined the Southern cause. The South was sort of unable to break the sanctity of the mailing system. Brown proposed to do the opposite, to send himself out using the mail system, the postage shipping system, to the North. So he got into this box, and they nailed him in. There was a slight hole. He had some biscuits and water. And then he set off on this journey that took 27 hours using basically every form of conveyance available at the time. First he was in a horse-drawn cart. Then he was on a ferry boat. Then he was on a train. Then he was back on a cart. He was carried by hand. Every time they traded systems, it seemed like they would drop the cart and leave it upside down. For a while, he was on his head. And eventually, in 27 hours later, he got to Philadelphia, and the men waiting for him pried the top off, and he got out and he said, "Hello, gentlemen." He recited a psalm in honor of his escape. In the picture of one of the engravings, there's 5 men there taking the box off, one of whom seems to be Stephen Douglas himself. At the end, this became a sort of extremely famous event in the sort of abolitionist cause, and he went on tour immediately, was sent to Boston and points north, and he developed a performance using a moving panorama. Those are enormous paintings that would roll across, and you'd stand in front and create the illusion of movement. You could move through space and time. And these were very popular. Douglas was actually a critic of this. He thought that they should keep the whole thing quiet so that they could continue to smuggle people out. He thought that they could have saved untold lives. As it was attempted several times afterwards, and they were always caught, and eventually the men involved in the South were sent to jail. When the Fugitive Slave Act was passed several years later, Brown was so famous he left the country because he knew he would be rearrested and sent south by basically by anybody who wanted to grab him for the bounty, a bounty hunter. He went to England. He continued to do these performances, but he also became a stage actor. He became a magician and a mesmerist. He married an English woman, and he and his wife and daughter started a show called Professor Box Brown and his family. He adopted the name Box as his middle name, and he lived in Europe for many years, and after the war he came back to the United States and continued to tour with his mesmerist act, but then moved to Toronto for the last 10 years of his life. Olivia, who's here, you remember your friend and colleague Wilmer Wilson IV, a student of mine. Before he was a student of mine, did this wonderful piece. He's about 6'4", 6'5", and he weighs about 150 pounds. And he stripped down to his shorts and covered himself with stamps and walked through the streets of Washington, D.C. into a postal service and asked him to be mailed to Freedom in honor of Henry Box Brown. They said, "We don't do that." So he took all the stamps off and put on a cloak and walked out. He was kind of hard to teach after that, to do a piece like that. It's a beautiful piece. In 1903, a woman named Anne Edson Taylor, who'd been a bookkeeper and a librarian, she'd had a professional career, and things had not gone well for her. She was 63, and she was terrified of ending her life in the poorhouse, and she resolved on a desperate scheme to ensure her financial security and fame. She decided to be the first person to go over Niagara Falls in a barrel. She had this large barrel as big as herself made out of oak. She attached an anvil to one side to give it ballast. She put a mattress in, and then she put her cat in, and she sent that over as a kind of test. She was no fool. And the barrel made it. The cat had a little scratch. So, to great fanfare, she put herself in the barrel. Thousands gathered along the edge. The barrel took about 20 minutes to get to the edge of the parapet, then went over, was lost for 20 minutes until it bobbed to the surface. She was extricated, perfectly okay, except for the same scratch on the forehead that the cat had. Her idea was that she would now go on tour with the barrel and tell the story of, there's a picture of her, it says, the heroine of Niagara Falls. She would go on tour and tell her story and achieve the security and recognition that was so important to her. It did not work out that way. Her manager stole the money and the barrel, and she had to make another barrel and spent the rest of her life with a secondary barrel telling her story, and in fact died in the poverty that she had feared, although she did achieve at least enough fame that she's in Wikipedia. I suppose that's something. Although she was the first person, more than most of us, she was the first person to go over the edge of the Niagara Falls, but there have been a number of stunts in the sort of frothy water below, and also above the falls. It was a lot of aerialists and daredevils. Well, I wouldn't say a lot, but a number had created these sort of spectacles. This is one of the most famous, you know what, it's time to give this up. One of the most famous locales in America, and this French tightrope performer named Blondin, known as Blondini for his blonde hair, conceived of a series of stunts across the river leading to the falls that were extremely famous. He had this wire strung from side to side, and then he advertised that he would walk across, and he did. And he walked back. And then he had to keep topping himself, so he would walk backwards, he would sit down, he would carry his manager over. My favorite, and perhaps his most famous stunt, was that he walked across with a stove on his back. When he got halfway across the falls, he sat down, he balanced the stove on the wire, and he cooked and then ate an omelet. And then when he was done, he put it back on his back and continued to the other side. Why? Nothing about that adds up properly, but the idea that you would walk across Niagara Falls and stop halfway through and eat an omelet is quite appealing. Apparently, when you read more about him, this was part of his regular act. He would, even in the circus performances, he would cook an omelet on the wire, but then he would often lower it down to the audience so they could eat the omelet. So we're in a great tradition of trying to gain the affection of the audience by giving them something to chew on. The next character who Tim sent me information about as an influence, if not on him, on the history of collage, was a woman with odd parallels. Several characters we've talked about. Her name was Mary Delaney. She was born in 1700 in England to actually a pretty aristocratic family. In fact, she was trained to be a lady-in-waiting for the Queen of England if James I had passed on the Stuart line. Her family, unfortunately, bet on the wrong horses, and after James' death, they reached all the way into Europe and got a Hanoverian prince and started the whole different line of German-speaking English kings, and she was sort of left with nothing. And as a kind of a burden on her family, they married her off to a drunken man about 60 years older than her, who lasted about 4 years until he died of apoplexy, which is a nice way of saying he was basically died of alcohol poisoning. And she spent the next 25 years of her life sort of traveling amongst the country houses of her friends. She had been raised to be about as charming and as accomplished as you could be. She could sing and she could dance and she could make conversation in many languages, and she could draw and cut out beautiful silhouettes in black paper, and she was in great demand. She was very good friends with Handel, whose harpsichord she played, and he played her harpsichord, and Jonathan Swift admired her a great deal. Jonathan Swift had a friend, Delaney, who was in love with her but was married to someone else. Eventually they overcame their differences. He was a commoner, although he was wealthy, and she eventually agreed to marry him, and they had 25 years together raising plants in his garden. They were both avid gardeners. And then he died, and she was in her late 60s. And then she spent the next 20 years of her life actually in her great work, for which she's known now. She had a patron in the Duchess of Portsmouth, the wealthiest woman in Europe. And she's, according to her, sort of chanced on this occupation. One morning she woke up and she saw a flower lying by her bed and a piece of red paper, and realized that the paper and the flower matched, and began to create these incredible collages that are remarkable for their accuracy of every plant that she could come across. She would use the paper to cut out the forms. Sometimes she would add ink and other forms, but then they were very dramatically presented against a stark black background, and they were admired and collected by all of her friends. At her death, in fact, there were thousands and thousands, which are now in the Royal Society, Royal Academy. When the Duchess died, she was in her late 80s, and George III, the grandson of the king who had actually sent her on this lifetime of sort of marginal exploration, took her in to be the tutor to his children, to teach them about botany and science, which is an interesting end to her career. When I saw these images, and if you see them, you'll be quite struck by their beauty, but also the sort of drama of the way they're presented, and the sort of starkness of the formal design of the plants. Although they were seen to be highly naturalistic at the time, they also have a very strong sense of formal design, and actually they reminded me of Ernst Haeckel's drawings, there you are. I knew we'd get to this. Haeckel was the German scientist, sort of an avid promoter of Darwinian theory in the late 19th and early 20th century, who was famous in his time for the drawings that he made of unicellular life mostly, but also he did other images of crustaceans and even larger animals. But the most beautiful ones were these microscopic organisms that nobody could see at the time, and there was no photographic system for recording them. And so what he saw, because he was a great scientist, was sort of taken as gospel. I keep looking at David because he wrote a brilliant piece about this in Cabinet Magazine. And what was remarkable, I don't want to get the facts wrong, but so he would create this would be some flagellate organism, and he would splay it out as though it was like made out of geometric straight lines from one point to another, almost like it was made of crystal instead of protoplasm. And then he wouldn't leave anything, even though it was on a black surface, he would put other organisms sort of in symmetrical arrangements around it. And then it was all set off against this jet black background. Sometimes his publisher would tip color in, and these became incredibly popular coffee table books at the time. And he was regarded as like a great progressive scientist. And at the time, he was highly esteemed. His ideas tipped quite easily into notions of social Darwin, and not just that plants and animals were in a struggle for survival, but that humans were too, and that human races would divide themselves off into the more and the less adaptive. And eventually the Nazis took him on as a kind of patron saint of eugenic theory and all the rest. The article that David wrote, which I will characterize too quickly to do it justice, is that it sort of poses a question. Was this bad science but interesting art because of the distortion? Was it bad art because it didn't represent the world properly, but interesting science because it clarified issues that other sciences could then build on? Or was there something sort of inherently disturbing about just the organization of the mind that would produce an image like this? I urge you to look up the piece if you want to read deeper into this study. The next man to consider in the history of the collage takes us to the idea of the photomontage. This is Oscar Gustav Rylander. He was a Swedish-born painter who moved to England and, according to his own fable, saw a photograph, a bit of sculpture, and thought that the way that a photograph could capture with incredible accuracy the folds of a sleeve of a shirt made it appealing to him as his sort of life's work. And he became a photographer, but a very progressive experimental photographer, and also a man of somewhat dubious ethics. He may have been the first pornographer. He made erotic photos in his early life, and he photographed urchins from the street, so he might have also been the first child pornographer. His great work was a piece called The Two Ways of Life. It was this epic photomontage. It's 32 different negatives were put together as a kind of proto-Photoshop. And it has a kind of Victorian combination of moralism and titillation. In the center is a man, a sort of bearded man in a toga, and he's flanked by two young men in sort of white togas. Togas do not do well in photographs as they do in paintings, because they sort of stand out stiffly and you end up looking sort of absurd. But so the two young men are looking to the left and to the right, respectively. In the center, beneath them is a semi-nude woman with a cloth over her head. And then on this side are all these naked female figures in various suggestive positions of repose. And on this side are characters who are cloaked in gowns, and there's a man working at a lathe and another man building something. So obviously this is industry and sobriety and propriety, and on this side is a life of license and indulgence and decadence. And it was quite notorious when it was first displayed, and in fact it would only be displayed with a sort of a cloth demurely over the offensive side, so you'd be called Two Ways of Life, but you'd only see this side. Then Queen Victoria bought a copy to give to her husband Albert, and that sort of legitimized the whole thing, and everybody got their own copy after that. Rylander was also well known for the invention of trick photography, and created a craze which you can see the results of to this day. There was a strange taste in Victorian portrait photography for the headless portrait, the self-portrait. This is a woman in a very elaborate dress without a head, but she's holding her head in her hand by the hair, and it's sort of grinning out at the picture. And there are many, many images like this. A whole bunch of policemen standing, grinning with their heads under their shoulders, or a family portrait of a mother without a head, and then her son holding her bloody head, and then her daughter holding an axe. Nobody's quite sure why this hit such a nerve, but it did for a long time. And it feels like it's a tradition worth reviving. There's an interesting story of another artist, writer, I can briefly summarize and misrepresent. Alexei North wrote a piece about Delacroix, the painter, called The Invention of Clumsiness. And it involves a bet he made with other painters in 1840. Delacroix was interested in photography himself, and he commissioned a photograph of a male and a female nude, posed in this sort of neoclassical style. A naked man with like a cloth here, and then this woman who's sort of crouching by his side, and they're looking at the camera, and they're in deep shadow. He invited these friends over, and he showed them this picture, and he said, "What do you think of these figures?" And they all were very critical of the bodies of the male and female, that he was too not. They don't say why they were wrong, but they found them quite offensively imperfect. May have been the foreshortening or the lighting or the fact that they were sort of ordinarily scaled human beings. Then he said, "Okay, what do you think of this?" And it was an engraving that we're not sure precisely, but it was probably by a Renaissance master drawing in the style or perhaps in a copy of Michelangelo nudes. It's a sort of series. The image were mostly of these sort of figures standing naked in a field in sort of various contrapposto poses. And he said, "Well, what do you think of this image?" And they said, "Well, now we don't like this either, because we can see how ugly, not how ugly, but how distorted these bodies really are. And they've been so used to seeing a representation of the body in a kind of perfected form that just having to look at an image of a body as it was created a kind of cognitive dissonance that they could never recover from." And so Delacroix felt like they were at a crossroads, that if photography would no longer allow us to enjoy the body, it would also never longer allow us to enjoy the representation of the perfected body, what could it do? What he thought it would do is become a tool for painters to enable them to actually make the perfect painting of the body, the sort of inverse of what we think of photography doing with the figure now, which was to replace that image. Well, the idea of the invention of clumsiness was that what it also did is create the body, images of the body caught between a pose in a state of liveliness that was not represented normally by a staged image. Relander had his last brush with fame through Charles Darwin, who admired his photos and hired him to take the images for perhaps Darwin's strangest and most interesting piece, which was called On the Expression of Emotions and on the Expression of the Emotions in Man and Animals. In his youth, Darwin had gone through sort of emotional turmoil and had been very upset by the implications of his theories about evolution and how they pertain not just to the evolution of the body, but to the spirit. It was one thing to say that our bodies reflected a kind of an ancestry in the lower orders, but there was something special about our emotions and our psychic life, which was locked into our brains. He was convinced that there was something just as animalistic, to use an awkward word, as about our minds as there were about our bodies, and that the access to that was through the expressions of the face, that you would blush uncontrollably or you would arch your eyes in surprise, just as a dog would do. He realized this was very controversial territory, that people would find this quite offensive, so he actually flipped the switch, and in the book, he sort of talks about the anthropomorphic quality of animals, that dogs sort of grin or cringe in a way that we can identify as emotions that we understand, as opposed to saying that we share those emotions with the animals. So he's sort of trying to find a back door into this argument. But he tried to make an objective study of human emotions. So he had Relander, the greatest photographer of the time, take pictures of people grinning naturally, and then he would stick them with an electrode and show what that looked like. And he used actors to sort of simulate what a face would look like. He tried to come up with an organic index or taxonomy of emotions that could be reliably called upon as a kind of thorough investigation of the relationship between the inside of the body and mind and the outside. It's hopelessly flawed, but a wonderful idea. Our friend Handel lived at 25 Brook Street in London. And one of the oddities of history, a weird collection, a collapse of coincidence, 200 years later, that same house was lived in for several years by Jimi Hendrix, who knew about this and actually collected albums by Handel. I think Handel paid £60 a year for this, and Jimmy and his girlfriend paid £30 a week. That seems like pretty high for the 1960s. It was during this time that Hendrix produced his last and most, perhaps greatest album, Electric Ladyland. Electric Ladyland is famous for All Along the Watchtower, I think, but also for the album itself, the cover art. Jimmy made a sketch of the cover that he wanted, which is quite bizarre when you think about it. He wanted a picture of himself and a bunch of children sitting around the Alice in Wonderland statue in Central Park, which would have been an amazing image. But the American publisher nixed that in favor of just a red and white sort of psychedelic image. The English album cover was more notorious. It's a photo montage right out of Rielander's heart. It's a series, it's some 30 naked women in dark shadows, all posing, staring straight out at the viewer. And they obviously don't belong in the same space. Hendrix was really offended by this. He thought it was disrespectful. And in fact, the album was often sold inverted, so this became the inside, and a more conventional image of his face was on the outside. Hendrix's drummer for many years was Mitch Mitchell, who had gotten the job through winning a coin flip. And after Hendrix died, he lost the job as McCartney's drummer in Wings on another coin flip. Lucky, unlucky guy. But it's thought at this point, in honor of Hendrix and Mitch Mitchell and Collage, I would finally shut up for 2 minutes and allow a real drum solo.
But you're going to draw.
I'm going to draw, but I won't talk if I can keep it going.
We did this a long time ago.
Just play the damn drum. All right. Nice. I didn't quite get the segue right. So, oh, yeah. So, another influential figure in male art was a proper English eccentric named Reginald Bray, a mild accountant by day and a notorious terrorizer of the British postal system by night. He read the entire manual put out by the postage system in about 1890, from cover to cover, this huge book. And he decided he would test them on various promises that they made. For some reason, they said they would deliver anything bigger than a bee or smaller than an elephant. Regardless, it should be packaged, it should be properly addressed. It didn't have to be packaged, it didn't have to be properly addressed. They would still do their best. Now, it's interesting to think about, what an important role the American Postal Service had been playing 40, 30 years before. In a similar way, the English Postal Service represented the edge of a sort of technological and communicative culture of the time. They could do anything. They could bring something from one place to another efficiently, safely, and discreetly. It meant a lot to the functioning of the empire, much like Amazon today. So his most famous stunts were to actually have himself mailed from one location to another. You walk in, you give the money, and they would escort you to the place you wanted to go. This was something they actually promised to do. You could mail your child if you wanted to, say, have your child sent to school. You would walk the child to the post office, and they could be mailed to school. Or if you wanted somebody to walk your dog, you could actually have the postman walk around. So first he did it before and then after postal, parcel post was invented. Everything was sent out with you would pay upon receipt. So if his experiments didn't work, he would get them back. And much as Tim was experimenting with placing the stamps or the addresses in various locations, Bray began making these very strange, if you take a picture, say, or a postcard of a rock off of the coast of the Isle of Orkney, and write on the surface, to be delivered to the person living closest to this rock. And he would send it out, and inevitably it would come back to him, or if it's not inevitably, it maybe got delivered and we never saw it again. But he conducted these experiments in various forms for many years, and then he became more interested in becoming the world's greatest collector of autographs. And he used this postage system to pursue this goal as well. He had a sort of a highly indexed system with many numbers. He would send these things out to famous politicians and generals and people in the entertainment business and in the news. And he accumulated 20,000 or so of these signatures, most of whom are people we don't know at all, which is sort of depressing. Some of them are just sort of interesting characters. One person that he approached was the captain of a trawler, a fishing trawler, during World War I, who had become notorious because he had failed to rescue the surviving crew members from a Zeppelin, a German Zeppelin that had been shot into the English Channel. For some reason, that image of a Zeppelin crashed into the water with a boat next to it. It's quite striking in my mind. I think he got the signature. But that image, oh dear, I need that or we can't finish. Thanks. That image of the boat and the ship reminds me of one of the more famous album covers of our time. Somebody here must know this. Let me see. Did I get that right? It's a Frank Zappa album. It's called Ship Arriving Too Late to Save a Drowning Witch. It's a droodle. It's a form of drawing which is a sort of highly simplified line drawing that functions as a kind of pun. I think Dre used versions of it himself for his addresses. And I had a book of puzzles for children, I remember, that had some examples. An image like this would be either a giraffe passing by a third floor window or the view of a highway from a bomb bay of a plane. But this was my favorite. It's an amateur's drawing of a tomato sandwich, which I thought in fourth grade was like the funniest thing ever, because I could draw a better tomato sandwich than that. And also this, if Missouri and Mississippi had a party, what would Delaware, Idaho, Alaska? I just had to get it off my chest. And also had this palindrome address. Like, somebody sent a postcard with this on the front, and it was delivered. Where did it go? Thank you. A cryptographer in the room. Thank you, Stuart. John Underwood, Andover, Massachusetts. Thank you. John Hartfield was a photo montage artist with a mission. He made some amazing images in the interwar years trying to combat the rise of fascism. His image of Hitler swallowing coins, or a German family eating machine guns and tank parts from a Goring said that guns were more important than butter. My favorite image is of an elephant. Two elephants with wings flying above the ground. It's called The Happy Elephant. It was in a magazine in Europe, and it said, why are the elephants happy? Will they be happy in the future? It doesn't matter, they're happy now. It was published right after Neville Chamberlain signed the non-aggression pact with Hitler. And this was as close as he could come to making a seditious statement at the time. The happy elephants. Flying elephants were obviously a pipe dream that he saw through. My two of my brothers in Africa were on a game farm. This is a slightly different story than I've told before. Apparently I've been telling the story wrong all these years. They were camping near a water hole, and they saw an elephant. And I don't know if you read that terrible story recently about the Italian tourist who was trampled by an elephant trying to get too close for a photograph. Well, that's what my brothers did. Actually, one of them did. One brother kept waving the other brother back closer and closer and closer to the elephant until the elephant had had enough and it swung its trunk. Elephants are very big, so you think you're farther enough away from the elephant to be safe, and you're not. He knocked him to it. He dopes to the ground. The elephant, he remembers the tusks and the trunk going over his head, and then the elephant sort of looking down and being ready to step on him until he scrambled away. And he was so upset that he went back to his tent and he wrote up an intricate account of this event, complete with other brothers urging him to go closer and closer. And he made my brother sign this document to prove for all time that he had endangered his life. And Josh thought it was just a joke. He said, "Yes, I almost got you trampled by an elephant." So it didn't have the desired effect, but it did produce a story which I guess I've misremembered all these years. There was a mysterious cigar roller living in Philadelphia. He'd been born in Cuba, and then he migrated to Miami, and then finally up to Philadelphia. He spent a lifetime rolling cigars, but in the evening he would go into his garage and he would create these incredible collages. His name was Philippe Spelios, and he's so little known that there is some doubt about his authenticity, which I think is a kind of an insult to his ability. He did perhaps collaborate with his son. Nobody's sure when his work began and the other work ended. He died without ever sharing this, and the work was in a garage for 20 years until it was discovered in the 1980s, and now he's a kind of a hero of the outsider art world. The images are quite sophisticated. You take dollar bills and cut them up. There are lots of images of George Washington in drag with lots of quotations that sort of create a very sophisticated and kind of quirky worldview. But you also put these things all over everything he had, from guitars to chairs to typewriters. I think he had a motto: a man, a cigar maker, a man, a healer. I like to think that when he worked, he probably heard many, many stories read by professional readers called lectors, who were a fixture in all cigar factories in Cuba and also throughout the United States. A cigar factory has no machinery per se, and so it's quite quiet. All the workers are rolling cigars all day long. And to pass the time, they would all volunteer to go up and read for a period of time while the other workers continued to roll cigars, and they would pass the hats to sort of cover the lost wages for the time you spent reading. Eventually this job evolved into something that professionals would do. They would read and sort of act out the news from the day, and sometimes they would began to read fiction, long novels. Victor Hugo was very popular, Agatha Christie, and when there was immigration into the United States, the lectures would follow, and they would have the double job now of translating the news from English into Spanish. As I said, mysteries were very popular. The longer and more complicated, the more likely they would be to be popular amongst the readers. If they weren't, though, they would throw the books out. They would throw the people out. There was a woman named Maria Martinez Gonzalez, who wrote 22 novels, none of which she published, but all of which she read over the years to her followers, and she had a career as a novelist within this community of cigar rollers. My friend Scott gave me a gift a couple of weeks ago, information about this writer named Harry Stephen Keeler, who could very well have been one of the people read by these lectures. He was a mystery writer who created immensely complicated long stories, except the only reason that he might not have been read, although at the end of his career he was only published in Spanish and Portuguese because no English publisher would touch him, is that he was the worst writer perhaps, who ever lived. Some people say he was the worst great writer, or he wrote such fantastically complicated stories that it's thought that he might have been a precursor to the Oulipo movement, the French sort of structuralist, avant-garde writers who would write novels without the letter E, impose all these strictures on themselves. Harry was a kind of a wild man who was a bit of a self-taught writer, but he wrote tremendously, a number of books, at least 70 novels in all genres, mysteries, but also science fiction. He had an amazing gift for titles, very strange, like The Case of the Transposed Legs, or The Attack of the Flying Strangler Babies, or The Case of the Two-Headed Idiot. He had a kind of obsession with weird dwarfs and sort of distorted bodies. The New York Times at one point wrote a review in 1942 and said something like, "Our only explanation for the peculiar novels of Mr. Keeler is that he writes the undisciplined urge for the sheer joy of creation itself." But he took himself quite seriously. He believed he had created, or was the foremost practitioner of something he called web work plotting. And he wrote a book about this, and there's an image of him as a spider in the middle of this elaborate web. And basically, and he has a lot of diagrams to sort of show how this is done. He believed that stories would be written with points of inflection. Something would happen, and then something would happen here, and then something would happen here, and then something would happen here. But by the time his diagram was done, it would be like everything was like on top of everything else. Because basically what he would do is he would accumulate thousands and thousands of newspaper clippings, and then he would sit down and try and sort them out and try to make a story out of them. And then if he ran out of material, he would take a short story that his wife, who was also a mystery writer, would have, and he would say, "And now I'm going to read a story," and then he would read a story. Or a character would say, "I have an idea for a short story. Perhaps you'd like to read it and tell me if it's any good." And then he'd just throw that in to the story. And he would keep introducing characters over and over and over again. He would write a 700-page book and only introduce the murderer in the last page from some other thing. And then at the time, his publisher would it was the tradition to have a point in the book, say halfway through, where you say, "You have now received all the clues you need to solve the mystery." But in Harry's case, you couldn't possibly do it because there weren't enough. He hadn't actually introduced the murderer until at the end of the book. I'm going to read you a passage. I don't know whether it's worth it or not, but Scott will appreciate this. This is, I think. Well, anyway, it's now become sort of picked up by hipsters but it's almost, well, some people find it intolerable. But you get a sense of this. Everything is a digression. Everything is a coincidence. Everything is a shaggy dog story that ends up with a kind of never mind. It doesn't really count. For it must be remembered that at the time I knew quite nothing, naturally, concerning Milo Payne, the mysterious Cockney-talking Englishman with the checkered, long-beaked Sherlock Holmesian cap, nor of the latter's bar bag, which was like my own bag, as one Milwaukee Wienerwurst is like another, nor of Lega, the human spider, and her 4 legs and her 6 arms, nor of Ichabod Chang, ex-convict, son of Dong Chang, nor of the elusive poetess Abigail Sprigg, nor of the great Simon with his 2,163 pearl buttons, nor of, in short, I knew nothing then, quite nothing about anything or anyone involved in the affair of which I am now become part, unless perchance it was my nemesis Sophie Kratzenschneiderwimple or Suing Sophie. Suing Sophie was a character in a novel who would basically run up to men at the end of a cruise ship and say, "Yes, I will marry you," and then sue them for non-support when they didn't marry her. And there was elaborate stories about her, but she's not actually a character in the story. It's just somebody would refer to her over and over and over again in the third person because for some reason he had gotten a hold of the story even though it had nothing to do with anything in particular. If there is a god of collage, I would think it is Ganesh. the elephant-headed Indian deity who was prayed to as the enabler of all things we desire, is worshipped above almost all other gods. The story of his coming to being is that he's the son of Shiva and Parvati. Shiva was away, Parvati wanted to take a bath, and there was no servant around to protect her. Again, I'm actually going to go through an entire panel of pictures. We're going to have to start. So she created a boy out of turmeric paste and told him to stand guard in front of the door and not let anybody in. So Shiva came home and wanted to go inside, and the boy wouldn't let him in. Shiva, who had a short temper, took out his sword or trident and chopped off his head. When Parvati came out, she was so upset. She said, "I will end all creation." This is one of many stories about how they happened, but perhaps the most interesting. He said, "Unless you bring this boy back to life." So Shiva sent his followers out and said, "Find me the first dead animal with the head pointing north and bring back the head." He brought back the head of an elephant, which he put on the body of the boy, and Shiva's worshipped before all other gods according to his mother's wishes. Pasted together figure. There's a shrine in the Yogashala where Jude and I used to practice that our friend Eddie, the Hindu priest from the Upper West Side of Manhattan, is the chief operating officer of. And in it are many statues of Hindu gods, including many of Shiva. You can pour ghee, clarified butter, honey, milk on them. And there's some thought that the more elaborated these figures are, the more venerated the gods will be, the more satisfied they will be with your offerings. Eddie knew we were sculptors and asked us to do him a favor, which was to create a mold of the base of the statue of Ganesh that they had there, which could be brought to India. Instead of the whole statue being brought, bring the cast of the base to a silversmith who would then create a silver overleaf for this that would sort of then be brought back and put on top of the base to create a more beautiful and precious manifestation of the image of the God. We agreed to do this, so we showed up with our tools, buckets of latex and plaster, sort of create a mold of the base and then a mother mold that he could then take to India with him. And he said, when you go into this shrine, into this altar space, you will be in hallowed ground, so you must behave accordingly. No swearing, no uncouth behavior, and no farting. And somehow it wasn't in keeping with my notion of what a kind of less uptight culture would be, but you can imagine how difficult it is when you go into a holy place with the instructions not to swear or not to fart. And maybe we fell short of our assignment. But in any case, we delivered to Eddie a workable mold of the base, which he took to India, to the small town where he practiced. He found a man who knew where a silversmith lived, who took him by car and rickshaw and dog and horse and foot down many paths. Look at that. Until they found the silversmith, who took the base and said, "I can do this. Come back in 6 months when you return to India, and it will be ready for you." So Eddie came back, practiced for 6 months or so, and came back to India, found his guide, and they retraced their steps by car and horse and rickshaw until they found the field in the road where they thought the silversmith lived, and there was nothing there. And they searched and they searched and they searched, and they never found it. And they shrugged and said, well, that's India. We'll never find it. Thank you.